It's Rivalry Week. MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football, breaking down the betting lines, and we bring in Steve Merrill from Pro Sports Info to help us out. It's Rivalry Week, and championships are on the line, and if nothing else, bad blood. So we'll run through all the games, and of course, we've got a full slate even running through Thursday and especially on Friday. All right, Steve, we always appreciate the insight. The Egg Bowl, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Rebels at home, but the Bulldogs are about a 10-point favorite.
Yeah, seeing them anywhere from 10 to 11 points right now as the road favorite. A pretty big line for this rival series. One thing I'll say real quick is the disclaimer this time of year is you often have to throw the records and the stats out the window when handicapping these rivalry games. Big rival underdogs historically have been a profitable play in college football. But as is always the case, you have to look at every game individually. And I think this is one game where I really don't want much to do with the big rival dog. I've played Mississippi State a few times this season. I felt like they have been an underrated team, one of the best defensive teams in the country, and I just don't trust Ole Miss right now. And even with this being a rival game, I'm not sure the Rebels are going to be fully focused like they normally would be.
Nebraska, Iowa, that's become a rivalry as determined by the Big Ten. They play every Friday after Thanksgiving. Nebraska's playing much better football these days. A win over Michigan State at home and going to Iowa.
Yeah, Nebraska's a team we've talked about quite often on the show this season, and what I keep saying with them is that I thought they had some talent. I definitely think Scott Frost will turn things around there. He did wonders at Central Florida, of course, but I thought it would take some time, and I wasn't going to try to guess, when that turnaround was going to happen. They have started to play a little bit better football in recent weeks. One thing I do not like is Nebraska as a favorite. They've rarely been a favorite this season. As an underdog, I think they're a safer play. And if you look at what they've done against the spread, not only have they won 3 of their last 4 straight up, but after going winless against the spread for the first month and a half, they have now covered 6 straight games. This is exactly what I'm talking about. They were bad, and now they're good momentum-wise. And I think you can make a case to keep riding that train here, as I think they're probably still a little bit underrated by the odds makers in general.
UCF and USF played one of the more exciting games in college football last year as UCF held on for a huge high-scoring win. Of course, they showed us something against Cincinnati, not just offensively, but defensively. Central Florida full 2-touchdown favorite against the South Florida team that started hot, but has been plummeting since.
Yeah, and I think Central Florida obviously could be in a letdown spot here. One of the biggest games they've ever had. Not only was it a national TV primetime spotlight game, but obviously they really wanted to make a statement that they deserved to be in the playoff mix, and they did that 38-13 win. Last week I mentioned that my power rate is favored by 11 points in that game. It was only 7, so I thought there was some line value with Central Florida. Also said I thought the under was worth a look. I mentioned 2 teams last week that had played very weak defensive teams, Syracuse and Cincinnati, and they scored 7 and 13 points, or actually Syracuse team scored 7, scored 3 and 13 points each. So it shows once again why schedule strength is so important as a handicapping factor. With that said, though, this looks like a potential flat spot for Central Florida. The question is, can South Florida compete? They're 7-4 in the season. They are 4-1 at home this year compared to just 3-3 on the road. And they're a pretty good offensive team, averaging 6.2 yards per play, decent defensively. They're really an average team on both sides of the ball. So if Central Florida comes in a little bit flat, I think the Bulls could stay within this 2-touchdown spread as a big home dog.
All right, let's get into these in-state rivalries that are huge within the state, even if not much championship implication. You got Oregon, who started hot, was a national factor for a few weeks after a few big games. Going to Oregon State, the Beavers have improved by the one game here at 2-9. The point spread's about 16.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those cases where you really would have to throw the stats and the records out the window to make a case for the big, ugly underdog in a team like Oregon State. We kind of knew coming in this year they would be the bottom feeder in the Pac-12, and they really have been. Oregon's been a little up and down this season. I actually had a best bet on them last Saturday night as a 3.5-point favorite. They had a double-digit lead late in the second half, held on to win by only 2, so that was a tough non-cover, even though they won the game. But overall this year, I think Oregon's been a bit of an underrated team. But once again, these games aren't as easy as they seem. The big rival dogs occasionally play better than expected.
And in a similar fashion, we've got Virginia and Virginia Tech. What's odd about this game is Virginia Tech has owned this series. They won 14 or 15 consecutive times, have been the much better program, but they're having a down year after a hot start against Florida State in week 1. Virginia's been plodding along as a decent team. So actually, Virginia, with the psychology you would think working in Virginia Tech's side, dominating this series, Virginia on the road is a 3.5 point favorite.
Can you imagine how much money you would have bet on Virginia Tech before the season began if you could get them as a 3.5-point home dog against Virginia, or any time in the last couple seasons? I mean, just to put this in perspective, they were a touchdown road favorite last year, and when they played at Blacksburg 2 seasons ago, they were a 19.5-point favorite. Now they're a 3.5-point dog. The odds makers have to keep adjusting the line. Not only has Virginia Tech gone 1-5 straight up their last 6, but they're 0-6 against the number. They have not covered any of their past 6 games. So this is a team that's just floundering right now. With that said, Virginia, it's dicey to lay points more than a field goal with a team that's not in this role quite often. They have lost 2 of their last 3 games, so it looks like they're wearing down a bit, both straight up and against the spread. But Virginia Tech's defense has just been decimated this year with injuries. They give up 6.5 yards per play. Virginia holds a substantial defensive edge. They're almost a yard per play better and almost 11 points better defensively in this game.
I'd like to remind everyone that you can join Steve at prosportsinfo.com. We're not going to cover every single game. There are huge rivalries all over the place, obviously, but I'm trying to pick off most of them and obviously get to the huge games with national and conference championship implications, like Oklahoma, West Virginia. The West Virginia loss last week takes a little zip out of this game, but it's still for a Big 12 championship game berth. And with this one being on the road for the Sooners, they're just about a 1-point favorite.
Yeah, I mean, Oklahoma is an explosive offensive team. They're as good as anybody in the country, even Alabama. In fact, Alabama and Oklahoma are really probably the 2 best offensive teams in the country based on my ratings. They're averaging nearly 50 points a game, almost 9 yards per play. That means every time they run an offensive play, they're 9/10 of the way to a first down, which is just incredible when you think of it in that perspective. West Virginia, average defensively. So Oklahoma is going to get some points and some yards in this game. But West Virginia, a very good offensive team as well. They're averaging 41 a game, over 7 yards per play. In fact, Oklahoma is slightly below average defensively when you factor in opponents played. So West Virginia does hold the defensive edge here at home. Oklahoma holds a slight offensive edge. I think you could really make a case so the over is worth a look. 81.5 is a big number, but as we saw in that Monday Night Football game this week, sometimes they can't set the total high enough with 2 great offenses and 2 mediocre defenses.
Some people might be surprised that are just hyper-focused on the playoff, that Washington State could fail to go to even the Pac-12 championship game in the Rose Bowl if they lose to Washington. There's just a 1-game difference in the standings in the Pac-12, and Washington can tie it up and obviously win the head-to-head. So even though Washington State's been the team with all the focus, with the 1 loss and a top 10 ranking, Washington can catch them and surpass them and get to the conference championship game. And Washington has dominated this series, but they're a slight underdog, about 3 points at Pullman.
Yeah, and look, there's no value with Washington State. The odds makers have to keep inflating the number. And if you look at what they've done this year, not only are they 10-1 straight up, they're 10-1 against the point spread. Meanwhile, the Huskies 8-3 straight up, but just 2-9 against the point spread. So you've got the best point spread team against maybe one of the worst point spread teams in the country. This late in the season, you normally find line value for that reason. But what's funny is normally a team like Washington that's 2-9 against the number has vastly underachieved, and that really isn't the case. Like you said, Mark, they could still take a claim here of the title with the win. And what I like about this matchup is their pass defense has been excellent this year. They give up just 5.9 yards per pass against opponents that average 6.9. So they're a yard per play better than average against the pass. And of course, that's what's really important when facing Washington State.
If you believe in recruiting rankings, Washington's got the more talented roster. We got South Carolina, Clemson, and what's interesting here is South Carolina is not a bad football team. Probably one of the top 40 teams in the nation. They are a 25.5-point underdog at Clemson. This is where Clemson and Alabama have reached these kind of heights against this kind of competition.
Yeah, and you also really could make a case that this is one of those rival dogs that's worth a look. Normally when you're getting almost 4 touchdowns, as you said, with one of these rival dogs, they're a pure bottom feeder, that just can't compete. You just have to hope that the favorite is overlooking them. In this situation, I think the favorite still might overlook them, even though they really are a top 40 talented team. I mean, South Carolina was actually one of my play-on teams coming into this season. They've gone okay, 6-4 straight up and 6-4 against the spread. I thought they'd be a little bit better. Clemson, meanwhile, 11-0 straight up. They're just 6-5 against the number. And they obviously have bigger games on deck here coming up in the near future, with the ACC title game on deck the following week. So I think this is a situation where South Carolina can hang. They have nice momentum from a 49-9 win last week. Obviously, that was against Chattanooga. But still, they're playing good football. They've won 3 of their last 4, both straight up against the spread. Would not be surprised to see this game closer than expected.
Again, there's a ton of games out there that have rivalry and regional significance that we won't get to, games that I love to track and watch as many as possible, Minnesota, Wisconsin, the like, and many more like that. But I'm going to grind it down to 3 here. 2 that go right into the national championship equation. The first one, though, I only bring up because this team has already wrapped up a conference championship appearance, and Pat Fitzgerald, the Northwestern head coach, made a comment after the game against Minnesota that he actually brought up the point spread to his team and said, "We are disrespected again." Are you kidding me? What were his words? That we're going to Minnesota and we're the underdog, and we've beaten Purdue and Iowa and Wisconsin, and we keep winning. We're the underdog. And then they went out and despite not really having to play for anything, they went out and covered for their coach.
Yeah, I like the fact that a coach references the points, but I've always thought as an underdog, it's a great, motivational tool. He's not going to be able to do that this week. They're an 18-point favorite. And after winning back-to-back weeks here as an underdog, in fact, they have not been favored since mid-October. They've been an underdog in each of their past 4 games, and they've gone 3-1 straight up. The only loss was against Notre Dame, in which they landed right on the point spread of 10. The last 2 weeks, they've won outright as an underdog, and now you're laying 18 points. This is a terrible flat spot for Northwestern. And they're also not an explosive offensive team. So you're asking a team that averages just 4.5 yards per play to win by 3 touchdowns or more. Hey, look, I know Illinois is not that good. They're just 4-7 straight up and against the spread, but they do average 6 yards per play. They've been really bad defensively, so this isn't as bad of a matchup since Northwestern's not an explosive offense and is definitely not in a good spot this week.
People that are a bit short-sighted will look at last week. Iowa beat Illinois 63-0, try to take that to the house and making comparisons between scores, and that generally doesn't work. All right, the 2 huge ones, and again, there's a ton of games that I would love to dive into, but you check out Steve at prosportsinfo.com for also the NFL and the NBA. Ohio State and Michigan, noon Eastern time. More eyeballs on this game every year, even when it's not pertaining to a championship, just because it has that kind of traditional magnitude. But this one, most likely a big favorite in the Big Ten championship game to get to the playoff, especially if it's Michigan. And the Buckeyes are at home, but obviously the comparisons are all on the side of Michigan, despite 10-1 matching records. Michigan about a field goal favorite.
There's no question this line is drastically different than what it would have been when the season began. It's over a touchdown off compared to Ohio State being home favorite when the season began. Now more than a field goal dog at +4. With that said, though, it's hard not to think Michigan's the better team here. You look at the offensive numbers, Ohio State slightly better statistically, about 5 points a game more, about 0.3 yards per play more. But Michigan's still an explosive offense, 36.5 points a game. But defensively is where there's been a huge difference. I've said all year on this show that Ohio State's a below-average defensive team when you factor in opponents played. They give up almost 2 yards per play more defensively than Michigan. So that's a substantial difference. And yes, it's weird to see Ohio State as a home dog of 4 points. And yes, this line has been a touchdown difference when the season began. But the reality is we're getting a team that's substantially better defensively in a really critical game, laying just 4 points. So even though there looks like there may be some line value, you got a live home dog, rival dog here. Hard to imagine Michigan's not going to be ready to play. And, of course, they also have the revenge motive from that 11-point home loss last year. They were a 12-point home dog a year ago. Now they're a 4-point road favorite. Just incredible.
And again, everyone, I know you're shouting out games that I'm supposed to get to, including the Iron Bowl, which is arguably the greatest rivalry in college football. But we're focusing right here on the final game, which is USC and Notre Dame, because the Irish may need to win this one to complete the undefeated season, obviously, but to ensure a playoff spot as a 10.5-point favorite at the LA Coliseum.
Yeah, what's crazy about this situation is if Notre Dame wins, then it's a huge advantage not having to play a playoff game or a conference championship game, obviously. If Notre Dame loses, they very well could be on the outside looking in, and they cannot do anything to stop that. So that's the chance you take. Hey, look, as a 10.5-point favorite here, I think they're in a pretty good situation as far as not having to play that conference championship game. This is a win and you're in. They'll be undefeated. They've played a legitimate schedule. I'm not sure they're one of the 4 best teams. If you look at my power ratings, they're not. But I'd have no problem with them in the playoff picture with an undefeated season. With that said, I think USC is a dangerous team here. Would not be surprised to see the Trojans pull the upset. They've lost 4 of their last 5. They're not playing good football right now, but they still have a lot of talent there. And I do think this point spread's probably a little inflated based on recent results.
I will have my predictions coming up later this week as the games unfold Thursday, Friday, and Saturday right here at Mark Rogers TV, and join Steve at prosportsinfo.com. We appreciate you stopping by, Steve, as always.
Thanks, Mark.